I want to start off by talking about political messaging because there was a pretty interesting study that came out recently by two political scientists at Yale. And what they were doing in this study is they wanted to look at how framing things as racial justice measures affected people's support for race-neutral policies. And before I dive into the study, I just want to say, right off the bat, of course, messaging is a very small component of organizing. I want to be really clear that there's, of course, no magic phrase that you can just utter that'll make people vote a certain way or behave a certain way, let alone become socialists, right? But that said, I do think it's important to think about how we frame what it is that we're trying to argue and what it is that we do. So when it comes to the racial justice frame, these researchers at Yale noticed that over the last couple of years, and over the last year in particular, where we've seen a lot of heightened attention to racial inequality and racial disparities, the researchers noticed that Democrats were increasingly leaning toward framing their policies as racial justice measures. So we have tons of examples of different politicians at the state and federal level saying that X, Y, and Z policies are reparations, for example. A very classic one is politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Ayanna Pressley have talked about student debt relief being a racial justice issue. So let's run a clip of Ayanna talking about that.
Let me be clear. The student debt crisis has always been a racial and economic justice issue. But for too long, the narrative has excluded Black and Latinx communities, and the ways in which this debt has exacerbated deeply entrenched racial and economic inequities in our nation. These disparities didn't just magically occur. They are the consequences of generations of systemic racism, discrimination, and what I call policy violence that has systemically denied Black and Latinx families the opportunity to build wealth, forcing our families to take on greater rates of student debt for the chance at the same degree as our white counterparts.
So this is interesting. Again, I feel like this is kind of a standard way that Democrats talk about a lot of policies these days. So what these Yale researchers set out to do was they surveyed around 5,000 people. I think each of the respondents took an online survey where they were exposed to different forms of messaging. And what the researchers wanted to determine is whether people's support for certain policies increases when it's framed as this racial justice measure. So I'm going to get to their findings in a second, but first I want to look at some of the messages that they presented to their respondents. So the first frame they showed to respondents was a neutral frame. And that reads something like this. So this is about increasing the minimum wage. So this is a very standard kind of minimum wage message. Congress has not increased the federal minimum wage, currently set at $7.25, since 2009. Some Democrats are proposing a policy that would gradually raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. After 2025, the minimum wage would be adjusted each year to keep pace with growth in the median wage, a measure of wages for typical workers. So, pretty dry, just a standard, like this is neutral. This is what a minimum wage increase would do. Then the researchers looked at how people responded to a race frame, which goes like this. So the people who were exposed to the race frame got kind of the standard messaging, the neutral frame about the minimum wage, but then they also got this. Democrats say that a minimum wage increase would boost incomes for people of color, especially women of color, who make up a disproportionate share of low-wage workers. This is why Democrats say that raising the minimum wage would be an effective tool for racial justice. So the researchers didn't just look at the racial justice frame. They also wanted to see how the racial justice frame compared to a class frame and then a class plus race frame. So this is where it gets really interesting. So I'm now going to read the class frame, which goes like this. Democrats say that low wages hurt all workers, especially those with lower income levels, and that a minimum wage would lift nearly 1 million people out of poverty. This is why Democrats say that raising the minimum wage would be an effective tool for economic justice. And then finally, the class plus race frame basically combines the race frame that I read before with the class frame, and it looks like this. Democrats say that a minimum wage increase would boost incomes for people of color. You can run through that. Again, like I said, it's just kind of mashing the race frame and the class frame together. A minimum wage increase would lift nearly 1 million people, Black, brown, and white, out of poverty. This is why Democrats say that raising the minimum wage would be an effective tool for racial and economic justice. So again, they kind of present their respondents with 4 different frames. And what they found, to now jump to the findings, if we can pull up that chart, is that among all of those, if you can look at the top line, the class frame actually did quite a bit better than either the race frame or, surprisingly, did better than even the class plus race frame. Now, I want to add a caveat here. The authors are really clear in their study that the results are statistically significant, but not overwhelming, right? So these are just moderate effects. So it's not like the class frame like so vastly performed the other 2 frames. It was just like, we noticed that this is doing a little better. And so I think that this is really interesting because, again, we heard a lot of discussion during the last, 2 presidential cycles about how we should be framing these issues. Most famously, Bernie Sanders was often hit with the charge that, he wasn't talking about race enough, although he does use the racial justice frame quite a lot. And the authors of the study point that out. But the point being that, this accusation was often leveled against him, that he didn't talk about race enough, that he was being a class reductionist, that he didn't get the language right. And so, again, I think that these results are really interesting because if we're just going from this study, it shows that there's some evidence, actually, that using a class frame isn't as bad as you might think. So I have a few more comments, but I want to turn it over to Paul now, just to see if you have any thoughts about, not necessarily about this study, but because you are not just a propagandist on YouTube, but also an organizer, what do you make of these findings?
Yeah, I mean, they're interesting, and I think they kind of confirmed a lot of what I've just kind of seen just through anecdotal experience. And I think, Eric Levitz had a piece out about this that kind of touched on this point, and I think it's kind of ironic because for so long, the strategy of the right wing has been to insist that policies that in fact benefit the majority of working people are actually just special programs for minorities, and that's how they demonize them. And I think, in a way, I don't think intentionally, but in a way, when the framing is so heavily, this is a program, even if you say disproportionately benefits Black, brown, and whatever, you're kind of playing into that same framing instead of insisting that, no, I'm not going to play into the race bait game that the right wing wants us to do. And, because we know that, in fact, like welfare programs actually are used by far more white people than Black people in total. So I think it's just kind of it's kind of undermining our attempt to defeat the right wing and kind of playing into that in some respects. And I also wonder a lot with this kind of messaging, like, who really is the audience? Right. It's like, are you trying to convince white people that these policies are good for people of color? And if so, that doesn't seem like a good way to convince them to support the policy, or are you trying to convince people of color? And I don't think people of color need to be told that these things are good for them or disproportionately benefit them. So in that sense, it's like, what is the audience? Right. And I'll tell you like a little anecdote about this. I think those of you people that know me or have seen some of what I've written know that I love talking about the post office. And I love talking
it's true,
about,
you do.
I love talking about how the post office especially is good for Black workers. Now, last summer, when there was all the attacks on the post office in Philly, a bunch of activists and organizations, we were flyering post office around the city of Philadelphia. And the post office, that was closest to me is in a majority Black neighborhood. Probably 98% of the customers are Black. It's not like I needed to tell those people that the post office is important for Black communities. A lot of them know it. And even in talking to them, talked about, oh, my cousin, my brother, my sister works for the post office, but also it's kind of not the real issue at hand. I mean, the issue was to save the post office. Like, I really feel like if I would have said that, the response either would have been like, yeah, we know, or like, why are you saying this right now? Exactly. Like, I don't think they would be like hostile to it. But so I think it's just important to note that it's like, I think like you've said before, like it is objectively true, actually, that these things would benefit racial justice. But like, I don't know where that framing gets us necessarily, whether it's with white voters or voters of color.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Like, who is this actually intended for? Because the underlying assumption is that people of color, Black voters in particular, will respond to racial justice messages, right? Like, this was the whole criticism against Bernie supposedly being bad on race. If you want to win over Black voters, like, you're going to have to amplify your racial justice message. I don't know how many times I heard that. And like you said, I don't think it's actually clear that that's what voters of color overwhelmingly prioritize or overwhelmingly respond to. I mean, I know that, that seems like an intuitive assumption, but a lot of the polling, actually shows, as we've mentioned on the show many times, that the things that voters of color and especially working class voters are concerned about are things like jobs, healthcare, the economy. I mean, what we call bread and butter issues. And they're not actually so concerned with racial justice language or, seeing, quote, people that look like them in, cabinet positions. Or at least those don't rank as high as, kind of the stuff of everyday life. And just to go back to the Yale study, they actually did break down, people's responses by race and by political orientation. And they found that for Black Democrats basically responded to the race frame and the class frame exactly the same. So there was no advantage for, framing things as a racial justice issue for Black voters. Using the class frame got the job done as well. And then also, I think, unsurprisingly, with white voters, there was a huge preference for the class frame over the race frame. Now, we can talk about why that is. I mean, obviously, there are still many racial resentments. There's still a lot of racism. I think that it's fair to say that a lot of white voters, have those resentments and don't. And again, much like the dog whistling around welfare in the 80s, don't want to or don't feel, supportive of programs that they think are intended for racial minorities. So, that's, I think that it is definitely something that, is, I don't know, I guess is you can say what you want about white voters, I guess, but at the end of the day, it's sort of well, we're trying to create a message in order to win this policy, right?
Right. And again, we don't want to confirm the stupid and inaccurate stereotypes about certain programs only being for minorities. And I think something else, and like you said, there's no magic message that is just going to do this for us. But I think another point is just clarity overall. And I kind of think about this as a high school teacher, because it's if I want an assignment done the way I want it to be done, I better be as clear about the directions and simplified in a way, And I think politically too, it's the more, the more dashes and slashes and parentheses and caveats you're adding to an electoral message, I just think whether that's about race or anything really, you want clarity. And I think that's just key. And sometimes things get very muddled when after every sentence you have to say disproportionately this, that, and the other. I just think clarity is very key, in general.